Hey, it's Joel Markowitz from Personality Hacker coming to you from Los Angeles, California. We just did two really big things that were really cool. We got invited to speak at the Jimmy Iovine Dr. Dre Academy at USC, where we spoke to some students about entrepreneurship and business, basically, the merging of entrepreneurship, business, along with the idea of intuition. So that was really cool. And then we just wrapped 5 days of our profiler training course. And in this video right now, I want to shoot into a quick video of Antonia and myself on stage talking about the differences when you're in a profiling session. So if you're a profiler or you're interested in profiler training, you're going to see a little bit of the content we teach live from the stage. In this video, we're going to talk about the differences between introversion and extroversion and some of the red herrings or some of the false reads you might get in a profiling session and what to look for so you don't misread someone that's actually an introvert that comes and shows up like an extrovert, or an extrovert that shows up like an introvert. So let's roll into this video right now and see some of the core content from our actual live profiler training event. Okay, so in this next segment, we're going to break it up into 4 parts, but we're going to talk about, in a profiling session, some of the things that come up as red herrings or these distraction lanes that take you down roads when we start to profile around the dichotomies that you may not be aware of in your profiling session. So we're going to identify some of these and unpack them in this talk here, and we're going to talk about how those could look, right? So let's start with the EI. And do you want to give me more context to that, or can we just go right into EI?
No, I think we can go straight into it. And so one of the challenges to profiling oftentimes is that people who come into profiler training bring with them a lot of assumptions around stereotypes that they've read. And this usually comes from a less sophisticated understanding of how these dichotomies actually work. And the reason why is because the underpinning of all of these dichotomies is actually something called cognitive functions. And cognitive functions have a lot more fidelity to them in how they relate. But if you've only ever been sticking with the 4 dichotomies, introversion, extroversion, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, and judging and perceiving, then unfortunately you're going to have an incomplete understanding of why people show up the way they do. So when somebody has behaviors that you've always associated with a certain dichotomy, but it's actually behaviors that people who have the opposite dichotomy can easily evidence as well, then it'll throw off your profiling. And it makes it complicated to reconcile sort of these behaviors that seem to only be in one lane when really they're just sort of human behaviors. So let's start with introversion and extroversion. Most of the time, the stereotypes around introverts is that they're shy, that they are retiring, that they have a tendency to not talk very much or enjoy people, right? That they're a little spiky, that they don't really like to have long conversations, and that they always prefer to listen. And while there can be introverts that are like that, there can also be extroverts that are like that. There are extroverts that are shy. Extroverts that go and default into listening, especially in certain contexts where they don't feel particularly comfortable. And the stereotype around extroverts is that they're the exact opposite. They're boisterous, they are high energy all the time, that they don't ever need alone time, that if they're not around people constantly, that they somehow feel incomplete, or that they're always disruptive to an energy, right? Because they're always blasting their energy everywhere. And it's unusual for introverts to show up that way, but that can happen too. If an introvert is in a situation where they feel very comfortable, when they feel like they're in sort of their home turf, and they feel like this is just an extroverted moment for them. They can also have louder energy. They can be boisterous. They can enjoy conversation for a long amount of time. So it's not really the behaviors that you're looking at when you're trying to profile. What you're actually trying to look for, or what you're looking for in trying to sort of suss out of the individual is really one key element. And that is, for introverts, the inner world is the real world. And for extroverts, the outer world is the real world. And that is the foundational underpinning under all of these behaviors. So what ends up happening is that there are certain things that you can determine based on vocal tonality and sort of gestures, and there are things about the person that will be cues and tells. But fundamentally, it is how their mind is wired. So you will have to ask questions or look for things that don't appear obvious. One major piece is that because the inner world is the real world, then that means that being alone is restorative since anytime an introvert enters the outside world and there's a piece of information that comes at them that doesn't gel with how they feel internally, they now have to reconcile those two pieces of information and try to figure out why the outer world is giving them feedback that that they don't relate to. And that reconciliation process takes energy. It's an energy drain. So when an introvert is in a context where the outside world is 100% gelling with how they feel internally, they won't have as much of that reconciliation process to go through. So they won't be expending as much energy, so they have a lot more energy to apply to engaging with that environment. That is to say, if they're around somebody who their inner terrain has mapped to, friends, intimates, family members, they can have conversations with them for an extremely long amount of time and not feel as drained. Whereas an extrovert, the outer world is the real world, and the inner world is the world that's a little less familiar to them. So if they're in the outside world and they're getting outer world feedback that actually calls up a bunch of stuff internally for them, things that maybe they haven't addressed, maybe wounding, maybe it's triggering for them, then that outer world experience is going to be maybe even perceived as hostile. And they might sort of back off the pedal. They might go into observation mode to try to figure out how to navigate through this terrain. That said, there are a couple key components. Extroverts on the whole will have a tendency to have wider vowels. They do have a tendency to not know something is true until they put it out in the outside world and listen for it. And so when that happens, then they're able to sort of play with it in the world that they're more familiar with, and then they'll know whether or not it's true for them. So extroverts have a tendency, not all the time, but they have a tendency to think out loud. They have a tendency to be more comfortable in the outer world space, so they have a tendency to project their voices. And they have a tendency to have more comfort in the space around them, so they oftentimes will have broader gestures. That's not 100%, but that is a trend that you can look for. Whereas introverts have a tendency to have smaller gestures because the world around them, they want to keep close to that inner terrain that they're comfortable with. They have a tendency to have smaller vowel sounds and keep their voices a little closer to that introverted space. And they have a tendency to think first and then talk, because why would they want to throw something outside of themselves they don't agree with, since now they've forced upon themselves that reconciliation process, and then they create more energy. Or excuse me, it takes more energy. So there are a couple things that are stereotypes that there's reasons why those stereotypes exist, but these are trends. They are not rules. And so once you start to dig into cognitive functions and recognize how introversion and extroversion is actually an application to how our mind is wired with specific intuitive sensing, thinking, and feeling functions, then a lot of it makes sense when an introvert or an extrovert is going counter to the stereotypes or counter to how they are expected to show up.
How many of you here have ever had an experience where sometimes you're like, I feel a little more introverted or I feel a little more extroverted depending on the context? I kind of feel like both. Okay, a few of you, yeah, obviously. So there's this idea of like, oh, I'm an ambivert, right? I'm everything. I'm introvert and extrovert. Where really, when you get down to the cognitive functions like Antoni's talking about, you see that we're actually both. It's what we're really leading with. We do have these elements inside of us, right? We have an introverted part of us and an extroverted part of us. That's why the cognitive functions are so powerful from a typology standpoint, is because we have all of these parts in us and we're getting much more fidelity. So when you as a student, when you're going through and you're profiling somebody and you're talking to them and they're exhibiting, you're looking at the cognitive function set that they're using, you're going to start to see some of the introverted parts of them and some of the extroverted parts of them come up. And these can be red herrings. These can take you down a lane of like, wait a second, is this person introvert or extrovert? They're answering one way in a context, there's the other, but that's that fidelity beyond the dichotomy of I and E. You get down to the cognitive functions, you realize that there's part of them that is both. And that's so powerful in the profiling part. That's why we focus on cognitive functions and profiling. That's why we dive down into that, because that's useful in the profiling sessions. And just an example of like extroversion, thinking it's all about people. Well, extroversion can be about the outer world void of people, right? Think about somebody like an ETJ, an ENTJ, for example, who's about, we talk about them leading with a process called effectiveness, right? Extroverted thinking is the technical name of that cognitive function that is in their driver's seat. It's about getting things done in the outer world, right? And so if they're accomplishing things in the outer world, sometimes that involves people, but sometimes that doesn't. Sometimes it's just building things or having things happen in the outer world. And so if you're in a profiling session and you ask them about like something around people, for example, trying to determine extroversion, they might give you a false read because they might say, well, I don't really want to hang around people a lot, or I get tired hanging around people, right? It's too tiring for me to hang around people for a long period of time. Well, now you might think, well, this must be an introvert, right? Well, maybe it's an extrovert who doesn't necessarily extrovert around people as much. Maybe it's about what they're doing, not who they're with. Does that make sense? Cool. So these are some things that you want to be thinking about in your profiling. As you're looking through establishing yourself as a profiler and learning this skill, there's much more nuance than just the introvert-extrovert dichotomy, and that's why we're going to the cognitive functions. All right, so that's a little bit about introversion, extroversion, some things to be watching out for. In the next video, we're going to go into the second dichotomy letter. So you got the IE. Next, we're going to talk about SN. So stay tuned. We're going to show you some of the red herrings and differences in that in the next video.